Just the fun part of actually doing two services is that sense of repeating yourself, but it's also the fact that my voice needs to adjust. So if my voice disappears a little bit as we go, this will be part of a training process. But the question that occurred to me during the week while I was thinking and preparing for the service this morning is just to explain to you what the purpose of the church, what we're actually here for. There's a lot of people think that the church exists for us just to attend and so on, just to turn up if you feel like it and all the rest of it. But what we make very clear as our mission and purpose as Barrow Valley Community Church is our purpose to exist, is our desire is to make disciples of Jesus Christ. Not to do anything else, not to be a social club or anything like that, but our purpose is in reaching the lost for Christ and making them disciples. With that comes the big question, and it's something that I was asking myself some time ago, and through the week when I was praying and preparing for this, I suddenly remembered something because somebody prayed a few days ago and it came back to mind, is that question as to why it is that two people can attend the same church. Now both of them can claim that they are Christian. They can say all the same things, you know, profess word for word what the other believes and so on. And yet, if you meet those two people out on the street tomorrow, for argument's sake, what you'll find is that one is so devoted to the Lord, is so dedicated to their faith and what they believe, you can actually see it. It isn't just what they say. In fact, the chances are they don't have to say it. You can actually see it in them, that there's something there that's radiating from them that's real. And it stirs a curiosity in you that you want to know what is it about you? You know, what is it about you? And you can see that that person, not only do they say, talk Christian and all the rest of it, but they actually live according to what they believe. The other person who's saying the same things and all that, you can meet that guy tomorrow morning, and the evidence of his life is as though his faith has absolutely got nothing to do with it. You know, he says all the right things, and I'm sure in his heart that he believes all the right things, but in practice, the only difference between that guy and an atheist is that he comes to church. You know, you wouldn't know anything about it, and you find that everything he does and everything he says contradicts it. I mean, he talks the Christian talk and all the rest of it, but lives as though faith has nothing to do with his life. The question that I was asking myself is, why is that? Why is it that we can have two people claiming Christian, but they're poles apart in how they work? So let's try and understand what the problem might be as we look at this subject this morning. And the first thing is, let's look at this term Christian, if we can move on to that slide there, Keith. Let's look at this term Christian that we all use. I think it's reasonable to say that maybe everybody in the room this morning would probably call themselves Christian. I think that's a reasonable assumption. Nobody's agreeing with me, so maybe you don't. Maybe you're all atheists and have just decided to come to church this morning, but I think for the majority, you would probably call yourself Christian. Now, the difficulty is that there are hundreds of thousands of people out there who don't attend church, have nothing to do with church, don't want anything to do with church, and they would probably call themselves Christian. You know what? There's unrepentant murderers, rapists, child abusers, liars, cheats, bank robbers, and you name it, that's out there. And if you were to sit them down in the corner somewhere along the line and ask them, you know, what's your faith background, they would probably say Christian. Now, that doesn't make sense, because how can we call ourselves Christian and live the way that people live? That's something we can come back to. But another problem with the term Christian is that for many people they define Christian as being good. You know, being a good person, you know, compared with him. Because we do that as human beings, we make comparisons. You know, compared to him, compared to her, I'm a good person. You know, I don't rob banks. I don't murder anyone. I don't do all of the sort of things that he does, she does, and all the rest of it. You know what? I'm a good person. You know, the problem is the Bible makes it very, very clear that by human standards, each and every one of us, no matter how good we think we are, the Bible makes it very clear that in God's eyes, there is no one righteous. No, not one. You see, we take the Bible and set it apart, and we make up our minds who we think categorizes as good people versus bad people. But in God's eyes, when we look at what the Bible actually teaches and what He teaches, He puts it totally differently. He says that we are all sinners that need a saving grace. So by comparing ourselves, by comparing myself to somebody else and how good I am compared to them, it's a very dangerous way of measuring up the standing of my faith. Now, a third thing that many people believe is that they are Christian because of a birthright. You know, the church they were born into, or the heritage and so on, because that's what it actually means. You were born into a certain church, whatever that church might be, and somewhere along the line that makes you a Christian, which would mean that being a Christian is nothing more than a heritage. Okay, so I don't know about you, but if we can move on to the next slide there, please. The previous one. The one thing is that when I was born, I received a baptismal service. Well, I didn't receive it, my parents did. You know, when I was, baptized as a baby and all that kind of stuff that we have this day. Now, the certificate that my parents got, I actually found it one time at home, and when I looked at it, it told me that I was a member of that particular church. What it didn't say is that I was a Christian. Now that stirred my curiosity, because the sad thing is that many, many people believe all over the place that once you're baptized as an infant and so on, that makes a Christian. Now I checked that out, because in practice, the difficulty is that if that's the case, how do you become, why do you need all the rest of the stuff and all of that? But I checked it out, and I asked not just one church, but I asked every church that I could think of who practice baptizing babies, does this make you a Christian? And each of them, from priests to ministers to whatever they are, I actually do these kind of crazy things. I'd like to check it out, find out what did they actually say. And what I found is that all of them said, no, we never said anything. My response is, well, that's what people believe. And each of them said, well, as churches, we don't teach that. We say they became members of the church, but we never say they became Christians. Sadly speaking, people believe the wrong thing. You know what? We live in a very, very messed up country, and it's getting messier all the time. In the so-called age of increased civilization, where everybody is supposed to be better off and all the different things, we find that behavior out there is getting worse. It's a nasty, nasty, nasty world out there, whether we like to think so or not. And I don't know about you, but when I look at all the evidence that I see out around me, both in popular culture and all around the world, I see absolutely nothing out there that suggests Christian or anything to do with this country. You know what I mean? Now, internationally speaking, Ireland is recognized both politically and religiously as a Christian country. But again, I see nothing Christian about it. I don't know about you, I see nothing Christian about the way this country lives. There's no evidence to suggest it. And that's very confusing. Because when somebody like ourselves want to present the gospel message to somebody out there, and that's another one of the parts of our mission, is to bring the good news of the gospel of Jesus Christ to the lost, the hurting, the broken, those whose lives are so messed up that they need some sort of hope. And that's many of the reasons why people go where they go, is they're looking for some sort of hope in something. That usually doesn't work, but the church holds the key. We've got the light and the power and the glory of the world, and that message is Jesus Christ. But you go to somebody and present that Jesus is the answer to all of their things, all of their problems, and usually people say, because they're so familiar with Christian and religion, the usual response is, oh, ha, ha. And is it any wonder when we look at so-called Christian, now we can go to that one, Keith, that's why people would say, I'd rather the other, if that's okay, very much. Because we're so familiar with Christian. There's a lot of Christian out there, but it doesn't make sense. How can a nation, how can churches, people, whatever, call themselves Christian and live the way we do? And yet, because of the confusion it causes when you present a message of hope, the association with all of this other stuff destroys people's perception of hope. I wonder where all of that comes from. It can only come from a blindness that comes from the pits of hell itself. So with that in mind, so with all of this in mind, what's the best way to start? And the best way to start is just go with a clean sheet. I just want to ask you this morning to just, whatever it is you believe, whatever it is you think, or anything like that, just park it for the moment over here and listen to what I want to say over the next little while, and after that you can go back to believing whatever it is you want. So I'm just asking you to clear a little space for a moment and just look at this. The fact that the term Christian was actually never used by Jesus, nor was it ever used by the Apostle Paul when they referred to people who believe. Apart from Peter, who used the term once in his writings when it referred to the suffering and our suffering as a Christian, the term is only used twice in the book of Acts. And in both instances, what you'll find, it was intended to be used to insult and abuse the people who followed Christ. It was insulting terms. That was the whole purpose of it in its context. Now we're going to look at that, and we'll see in Acts chapter 11 and verse 26, notice how the writer of the book of Acts put it. That's Luke, who put it like this: the disciples, that's Luke's description, were called Christians first, the people's description in Antioch. See, Luke calls them disciples, the people called them Christians. The second thing you see in Acts is Acts chapter 26 and verse 28, where Paul is brought before King Agrippa. And King Agrippa is there being interrogating Paul and so on. But Paul does what Paul did best. Here's an opportunity to get this guy to come to Christ. Bring him to Christ. And Agrippa's thing is, do you think in such a short time you can persuade me to be a Christian? It's his way of saying, I've heard of these nutcases. I've heard of all these insults. And you want me to be insulted along with you? Do you really think I'm such an idiot that I'm going to become one of you lot? Now look at what Paul's answer actually is. And you'll find it in the next verse, verse 29. And that's where Paul says, short time or long, I pray to God that not only you, but all who are listening to me today may become what I am. So that's a big question. What exactly was Paul? What did he claim to be? Now for anybody, and we always encourage people, pick up your Bible. Read it, read it, read it. Get used to reading it and read it some more. And when you've read it some more, read it again. Always read what it says. And when you find Paul's writings, the epistles, what you'll find over and over again is his introductions as to who he was. And what you'll find is he introduces himself as either a disciple or a servant of Jesus Christ. Never once does he refer to himself as a Christian. What he was, who I am, was a disciple or a servant of Jesus Christ. What you'll find is when you look at that word disciple, it appears some 26 times in the New Testament, and in the plural sense there's an additional 258 times, which means that some 284 times in the New Testament you've got this term disciple, compared with just those couple of instances of Christians. And that's exactly what you'll find when you read the pages of the New Testament, is disciples. Disciples. Who questioned Jesus? Who were with Jesus all the time? The disciples, the disciples, the disciples. Jesus never called anyone to become Christians. He called them to be followers. The question I ask you this morning, as much as I asked the earlier group here, what would you call yourself this morning? A Christian? Or would you call yourself a follower of Jesus Christ? There's a serious difference. There really is a world of difference between the two. See, it's a simple thing to just be a Christian. It's a totally different matter to be a follower of Jesus Christ. So what might we use to give an idea of what I'm talking about here? And number one, I don't know how many of you are into sports and so on, but you'll find, if we can find, did I miss one? Oh yeah. Okay, there what we are, we've got Usain Bolt there and so on. But I don't know what your definition of a, a superstar is, but have you ever noticed that when I was young, I'm too old for it now, but when I was young, I had certain characters that I just wanted to be like them. I wanted to model myself, become as successful as they are, and, do whatever you have to do. And, I read a few years ago about somebody in the Olympics who just really was so taken by Usain Bolt that he wanted to become just like him, as successful as him. The thing is, this particular guy, determined in his heart that he was going to do whatever he had to do to become like that guy. And that happens a lot. There are those who, when they want to model themselves and become as successful as their role models, they will do whatever it takes, whether it hurts, whether it pains, whether there's disappointment in the trying. They will go, they will put whatever time, effort, and energy it is into making it happen to become as successful. And likewise, disciples of Christ, what do we need to do in order to model ourselves on Jesus Christ, who he is, and how to become just like him? We want to take on Christ and live his life through us so that we can be developed and devoted into the likeness of Christ. You know what? For those who model themselves on guys like this as successful and so on, it doesn't matter what life will throw at them. It doesn't matter what gets in their way. It doesn't matter what happens. Even if the whole of hell itself dumped itself on their shoulder, it would not stop them from making this happen. They will find the time, they will make the time to be trained and become just like their role model. You know what? That is what a disciple does. I know in those senses they don't use the term disciple, but you know what? That's what it actually is. It's almost as though these guys take on a role of discipleship. Those who follow him, those who want to become like them, become disciples. They watch them, they see their movements, they see how they train. They do whatever they need to do to learn to become just as successful. You know what? Likewise, we need to learn to see Christ the same way. Look at him, read him, watch him. How does he live? How can we learn from him? How can we become like him? See, the thing about it is that that's what a disciple does, and there's very few people willing to take that path. You see, for the majority of us, it's so easy to admire somebody like him. It's easier to admire him than it is to become like him. See, to admire somebody, that doesn't cost me anything. That's not going to hurt me. See, I can admire and be amazed with Usain Bolt. It's not going to change my life, though. You know, great people through the years have been admired by thousands. But more often than not, those great people had very few who followed. Back in the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr., was a black civil rights activist, and boy, did he transform the States. And you know what, as you can see in just that one picture alone, the thousands who turned out to listen to him. They listened to him, they applauded him, but very few actually went to jail with him. Mother Teresa, one of the most famous nuns in history, had an incredible calling. I was telling the guys earlier that I read a book about her just a couple of years ago, and boy, is it a book well worth reading. Her whole story of her calling. Politically, universally, she was known everywhere. Everybody knew and heard of Mother Teresa. But in spite of all of the massive fame she had, the record of those who joined her in the slums of Calcutta is very few. Very few. See, likewise in the gospel, and even today, there are many people that love Jesus, they admire Jesus, they're amazed by the things he did. How many times do you read in the gospels where Jesus performed all sorts of miracles and all sorts of things, from raising the dead to restoring the blind, helping people walk, the cripples to walk again? And people were amazed. You actually see it in writing. They were amazed and they praised God at what he did. And they hallelujah and all of the other stuff. But very few were found at the cross that day. You see, they admired him. They were impressed by him. They applauded him. They approved of him. They just didn't follow him. You see, what we find is that an admirer is impressed, but a follower is devoted. An admirer will applaud, but a follower will surrender. An admirer will approve, but a follower will obey. See, what we need to do is have a self-examination. You know, I was sharing a little earlier that there was that time, you know, when a couple of weeks ago when I wasn't feeling too well, and every time I mention something like that in my house, I get turfed out to see the doctor when I don't particularly want to see the doctor. But I know what the agenda is. There's a hope that my cholesterol will be found to be high, and that will mean there's a lot more sermons for me to listen at home. But usually I come home very successful, very proud of myself that when my blood tests come back, my cholesterol is spot on. You know, it's absolutely great. I love it because I'm the only one in the family who has low blood, who has good cholesterol. The rest of them, for all their healthy eating and all the rest of it, you know, their cholesterol is high. So I have a victory dance every time I come home from the doctor. But yet, the one thing about it is every now and then it reminds me we need spiritual health checks. No matter where you are where you're at, whatever part of your journey, whether you've started the journey or whether you've been a long time in the journey, sometimes you need to do a heart check. Spiritual heart check. And Paul actually says that we need to remind ourselves that every so often we need to examine ourselves to see how we're getting on this journey. How are we getting on this journey? Because sometimes you can start the journey well, and somewhere along the lines you've got derailed. You don't even see it. You've got derailed and you're talking all the right talk. You're saying you're still coming to church and all the different things, but somewhere along the line you've gone off the rail. How often do we get a spiritual health check? I try to do it as often as I remember. And it's good to have a spiritual health check. Because what you'll find is that Jesus impresses us. Just like he did King Herod. You know, King Herod, according to the Gospels, heard about Jesus. He wanted to see him. He wanted to see the magic show because he'd heard about all the miracles and all the rest of it. So on the night that Jesus was arrested, Herod has his chance and thought that by having Jesus there, he would see all the magic show. He would be entertained by it. Because you know what? We live in a world too where those who even come to church are entertained by the things that has Jesus in their name. Herod had an admiration for Jesus. He was fascinated by them according to the Gospels. But you know what? There's no record that Herod ever followed him. Pontius Pilate, the prefect of Jerusalem or Rome, you know, held trial Jesus that very day. He found nothing wrong. He tried his best. I'm sure this guy was convinced he had the Son of God in his presence. But you know what? There's no record of Pilate ever coming to become a follower either. You know, there was a rich young man one day came to Jesus, and he was so impressed with Jesus. He was so amazed by everything that he saw and probably witnessed that he went to Jesus and said, "Tell me what to do. Tell me what I must do to become one of yours." And then when Jesus tells him that you've got to sell it all up, give all of your wealth to the poor, we find that the guy walked away because Jesus had asked him just that little bit too much. You see, this guy approved, but he wasn't prepared to obey. You see, it's so easy to be a Christian, as we commonly use the term, than to be an actual disciple. Because when a disciple is actually called, what do? A disciple obeys. So how can we do a spiritual check and go back to the first question I answered as to how we have so many people, especially in church, who talk the right talk, but one is living devoted to the Lord and the other, in spite of what they think and say and all the rest of it, lives as though they're an atheist, Christian atheist. So to help us have a bit of a better understanding, say it slowly and that helps, you know, let's have a look at three things. And one is public profession. You know, public profession. So what does that mean? Public profession is everything that I say to you to convince you I believe something, even if I don't. Do you know what I mean? Let me give you an example of that. Is that when I go home and my wife, you know, we're going out this evening or something like that, and she dresses up for the evening and asks my opinion as to how she looks. You know, that's an indirect way of saying, does this dress make me look fat, and all the usual kind of stuff. And if you're a husband or whatever this morning, you'll probably know that such questions are designed to trap you. You know, they're designed, you know, to lure you into spot. And you've got to think, regardless of what you think, you've got to work it out, because you're thinking, what answer will I give her that I believe she wants to hear? You know what I'm saying, guys? Yeah, you do. Yeah, you're trying to work out, and then after you give the answer, you swallow hard and hope that it's the right one. But what you're really doing is giving her the answer you believe she wants to hear. That's just a personal example. But that's a public profession. It may not be the truth, but I'm actually telling her, I don't do that. I usually get into trouble, but I'm just using an example of the things we try to do to avoid. You know, you're in the situations. I mean, times when we're in the streets, you know, giving out invitations to church. Yeah, I'll be there. I'll certainly see you on Sunday, and all the rest of you kind of say, if we had, you know, one seat filled for every person who says that, the place would be, we'd be having 4 services on a Sunday. You know, people tell you what you want, they believe you want to hear. What about politicians? You know, politicians are a good example, because they'll tell you everything that they want you to believe. But it's easy to tell when a politician is lying, simply because their lips usually move, you know, in the process. That's a good, helpful example. But let me tell you, here's another example from the Bible, and again, it's King Herod, not the same guy, but a different Herod. Herod was just a title that they went under. It tells us that when the Magi came looking for Jesus, Herod's thing was, you know, tell me, when you find him, tell me where he is, because I want to go and worship him too. But the Gospels actually make it very clear that his intention was to kill him. It wasn't to go and worship him. No, so he told the Magi what he felt they needed to hear and believe, so that it got him what he wanted. Second thing we need to look at then is private convictions. You know, private convictions are what I actually think I believe, and I might be very sincere about what I think I believe, but when circumstances change, when situations happen in my life, everything about what I believe just turns out to be different. You know what? When all hell and life itself is dumped on my shoulders, very often I discover that everything that I thought I believed and felt very strongly about yesterday are suddenly blown away as though it never happened, and though I'd never believe it. You know what? As people, it's very easy to come in here on a Sunday morning, or when everything is going good, it's very easy to talk a strong talk. You know, we really believe, we really praise, and all the rest of it, but tomorrow all hell falls down on top of your shoulders, and suddenly the God you are proclaiming to be great today is not so great tomorrow. In fact, I'm not even sure he exists. How could he exist and allow all this stuff to be dumped on my shoulder? You know, it couldn't be right. You know, so while I'm there so convinced yesterday, why has it all gone wrong today? It's so easy to talk a strong talk, isn't it? You know what? One of the greatest examples in the New Testament is Peter. We find that the night when Jesus was arrested, Jesus had already told him, you know, you're going to deny me 3 times, Peter. And what does Peter say? No, I won't. What would you know about it, Jesus? You know, what would you know? I will go and I will die with you, not me. And Jesus said, no, you won't. You will deny me. And Peter, it actually tells us that Peter virtually took an oath. Not me, I will die with you. But yet when the circumstances changed, Peter's convictions changed with him. I don't know about you, but there's been so many times in my life when I was so sure. I was so sure about the strength of my convictions until the rain, the fire came and blew it all away as though it never existed. And suddenly the questioning God, is God really there? We can be so deceived by what we think we believe. But then the third thing is core convictions. You know, core convictions are who we actually really are. They can be seen in how I actually live my life, in how I actually behave. Core convictions come from deep within, and they demonstrate who you really are. We live according to what we really believe from deep within. So you can say all you want publicly. You know, you're entitled to believe what you think you believe all you want, but what's really deep inside you will determine how it is you live. And you see, when we enter the world of Jesus, what we find is that Jesus enters our world when we allow him to, and his purpose is to focus on changing those core convictions in every one of us, because it's at the core transformation begins. You see, if you're a follower of Jesus Christ, you will allow him that privilege. You will allow him the honor of changing you from the inside out, and that's what biblical faith and biblical discipleship is all about, is a transformation that happens from the heart and works its way out like those living waters we heard shared last week, streams of living water bringing life to all around. Because Jesus knows the core of our being, and he knows exactly what is in each one of us that needs to be transformed into his likeness. He tells people in Matthew 15 and verse 19 that it's out of the heart, out of the core comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, immorality, theft, false witness, lying, slander, you name it. That comes from the heart. That's what we're like at the core, whether we feel like it or not, whether we agree with it or not, at the core of our beings. And Jesus said that, not me. It's not the church who actually said that, it's Jesus who said that. At the core of our beings, there's a necessity for transformation. And it's only Jesus can do that. It's only he who can enter the core of our beings and bring it out. But sadly, many of us see nothing wrong with the core simply because we believe that as Christians, we're all good people. The Bible says, no, we're not. No, we're not. Our only goodness is when our lives are surrendered to Jesus Christ, and before God the Father we stand alone in the righteousness of Christ. It's in his goodness. And when we allow Jesus to enter our world, what we find him doing is changing the core of who we are, the core of our being. Transforming every one of us, whether you've been on the road a long time or whether you've never even started the journey. Transformation begins at the core when we allow Jesus to enter our world, enter our lives, and begin the changing process. Is that something that we can do this morning? Is that something we're willing to do? Or would we rather just be Christians? The world is full of Christians, and you know what? They're not impressed. The world is not impressed with Christian. I've spoke to people from different faiths, and they've actually said to me, we've heard what a Christian is supposed to be. But we see this country Christian, and we don't like it. They actually see it as blasphemy, the way we live in our country, calling ourselves Christian. But yet if we allow Jesus to be the core, the value, the transformation power from the heart out, people and the world around us, that's the purpose of our two services, to create a greater invitation to see the life of Christ living like streams of water flowing from the inside out and affecting all those around us. Is that what we want to be? I pray that this morning it will be the invitation to say, Lord, here I am, use me. And I'm going to invite the worship team up this morning as we close this second service. Thank you again for joining us this morning. And next week, invite all of your friends, invite everyone to hear the gospel, because we're creating a greater reach. But Jesus Christ, the hope of the world, Lord, I pray this morning that if we don't know Jesus Christ as Lord, we know a lot of Christian stuff, but we actually don't know you and the transforming power of Christ in our lives. Lord, I pray this morning that we can come, we can give you, we can honor you by allowing you the privilege of changing us from the inside out. And for those of us, Lord, who might be on the journey a long time, Lord, I pray that we too can reassess where we're at in this journey, and if necessary, renew the desire to surrender our lives to you for the glory of Jesus. I'm going to invite the prayer team up, whoever is here for the prayer team, and join us afterward. And I would say for